February 19th, 1943. Deep beneath the frozen streets of Berlin, inside a concrete bunker reinforced with 3 meters of steel and stone, Oberleutnant Klaus Zimmermann sat before his Enigma machine, fingers dancing across the keys with practiced precision. The rhythmic clacking of rotors spinning and electrical contacts closing filled the cramped communications room, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Outside, the temperature hovered at -12 degrees Celsius, but inside the bunker, the heat from dozens of encryption machines and radio transmitters created a stifling warmth that made sweat bead on his forehead. He believed with absolute certainty that his messages were mathematically unbreakable, protected by quintillions of possible combinations that would take enemy cryptanalysts centuries to decode. He had no idea that 5,000 kilometers away, in a nondescript building at Arlington Hall Station in Virginia, a young American woman named Dorothy Chen had already read his morning dispatch before his commanding officer had even finished his breakfast. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the greatest secret of the Second World War was not kept by those who possessed it, but by those who discovered it, and how the invisible war, fought in electromagnetic waves and mathematical patterns, would prove more decisive than any conflict waged with steel and fire. Klaus Zimmermann was a third-generation Prussian military officer, trained at Germany's most prestigious signals academy. Assigned to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Communications Division in 1941, his role was critical: encrypt and transmit orders from the highest levels of German military command to field commanders across Europe and North Africa. The Enigma machine before him was an electromechanical marvel that used rotating cipher wheels to scramble messages. With combinations exceeding 150 trillion, the German military leadership had absolute confidence in the system, never imagining their encrypted radio signals might be captured and understood. But across the Atlantic, a massive secret operation was underway, one that would eventually employ more than 10,000 people. Dorothy Chen was 24, a mathematics honors graduate from the University of California. In 1942, she received a mysterious government letter about vital war work of a confidential nature. 2 weeks later, she was on a train to Washington, having signed documents forbidding her from discussing her work with anyone, even family, for the rest of her life. Arlington Hall Station, once a finishing school, now housed the Signal Intelligence Service. Dorothy's supervisor, mathematician William Friedman, handed her intercepted German transmissions. "Your job is to find patterns where none should exist," he said. "The enemy believes their cipher is perfect. Your task is to prove them wrong." Dorothy stared at pages of seemingly random letters and felt excitement mixed with dread. Somewhere in these letters, hidden beneath mechanical encryption, were actual German commander communications. She was not alone. In Britain, at Bletchley Park, thousands more cryptanalysts worked on the same problem. The breakthrough had come there first, thanks to mathematicians including Alan Turing, and captured German materials from Polish intelligence. By 1943, the British had achieved Ultra, the ability to read German Enigma traffic regularly. But the Germans had no idea. On that February morning in Berlin, Klaus Zimmermann was preparing to send a routine operational summary. The message detailed supply convoy routes through occupied France, timing of troop movements, and fuel allocation to panzer divisions preparing for spring operations on the Eastern Front. Sensitive information, certainly, but Klaus felt no anxiety as he typed the plain German text onto the Enigma keyboard. Each letter he pressed caused electrical current to flow through the spinning rotors, lighting up a different letter on the lampboard above. His assistant, Gefreiter Hans Becker, carefully wrote down each illuminated letter, creating the encrypted version of the message. The process took 17 minutes. When it was complete, Hans carried the encrypted text to the radio room, where operators transmitted it in Morse code, short bursts of electromagnetic energy that rippled invisibly through the atmosphere, bouncing off the ionosphere and propagating across thousands of kilometers. What Klaus did not know was that those radio waves were being captured by massive antenna arrays at listening stations in Britain, Gibraltar, Egypt, and even the east coast of the United States. Within minutes of transmission, the encrypted message had been intercepted at 7 different locations. Each station recorded the signal, carefully noting its frequency, time of transmission, and estimated origin point based on signal strength. At Arlington Hall, Dorothy arrived for her shift at 8 in the morning. Fresh intercepts sat on her desk. She recognized common characteristics: same transmission time, frequency patterns, likely the same sender. Operators developed habits, and habits created patterns. She began frequency analysis. Even with Enigma's complexity, certain German language properties persisted through encryption. The letter E appeared more frequently. Certain combinations were common. German military messages followed predictable formats: standard opening phrases, common words like regiment or division, formulaic signatures. These cribs were the cryptanalyst's entry point. Guess part of an encrypted message, and you could work backward to determine that day's Enigma settings. Dorothy had worked German army traffic for 8 months. She had developed intuition for patterns. This morning something caught her attention. 3 messages all ended with the same 5-letter group. Unusual. The Enigma's rotors should prevent such repetitions, unless the sender made an error, failed to advance rotors between messages as required. Dorothy worked with fierce concentration. By 11, she had a breakthrough. The repeated ending was Zimmermann, the operator's name, used as signature, arrogance that helped cryptanalysts. Once she had that anchor, the rest yielded secrets. By 2 in the afternoon, she had decrypted all 3 transmissions, detailed information about German supply operations, troop concentrations, planned movements. She took the decrypts to William Friedman. He read carefully, expression unreadable. "How confident are you?" he asked. "Very confident, sir. I have checked 3 times. The operator's procedural error allowed me to determine the key." Friedman nodded. "Good work, Chen. Very good indeed. I will pass this to intelligence." What Dorothy did not know was how her work would be used. The decrypted supply route information was immediately passed to Allied military commanders. Within 48 hours, American bomber groups received updated target lists. German convoys Klaus Zimmermann thought were secretly moving through occupied France found themselves attacked by aircraft that seemed to know exactly where and when they would be vulnerable. German officers whispered about traitors and spies. How else could the Allies know so much? The possibility that their unbreakable encryption had been broken seemed too far-fetched to consider. In Berlin, Klaus noticed increased Allied air activity, but attributed it to bad luck and good enemy reconnaissance. The mathematical sanctity of Enigma remained beyond question, but Hans Becker, his young assistant, had begun to have doubts. Hans was 19. Conscripted into signals work for his quick mind and steady hands. Unlike Klaus, educated in military certainties, Hans had a questioning nature. He read widely and paid attention to patterns others dismissed. He had noticed something odd. Several times recently, when they transmitted information about upcoming operations, those operations would be disrupted within days, sometimes hours. Convoys attacked, ammunition depots targeted, as if the enemy could read their messages. One evening in early March, Hans voiced his concerns. "Oberleutnant, may I ask a question?" Klaus looked up. "Of course, Becker. What is it? Have you noticed the recent pattern of Allied attacks? They seem unusually well informed." Klaus frowned. "Good intelligence on their part, I suppose. Aerial reconnaissance, perhaps informants. What are you suggesting?" Hans hesitated. "Sir, is it possible our encryption is not as secure as we believe?" Klaus stared, then laughed harshly. "Becker, the Enigma cipher has quintillions of possible combinations. Even if the enemy captured our machines, which they have not, it would take longer than the age of the universe to break a single message by random trial. The mathematics are absolute. But what if there are patterns we have not considered, weaknesses in how we use the machines?" Klaus's expression hardened. "That borders on defeatism, Gefreiter. The system is sound. The Reich's best minds have verified it. Do not let Allied propaganda undermine your confidence." Hans nodded and said nothing more. But privately, his doubts grew. He was right to be doubtful. By spring 1943, Allied signals intelligence had become extraordinarily sophisticated. At Bletchley Park, the British had developed electromechanical bombs that tested thousands of Enigma settings per hour. At Arlington Hall, teams like Dorothy's refined analytical techniques, exploiting operator errors and procedural weaknesses. Intelligence from broken Enigma messages, combined with successes against other codes, profoundly impacted the war. Allied commanders in North Africa, reading German supply reports, knew exactly when and where to strike. In the Atlantic, the grim submarine war was turning as Allied naval forces, reading encrypted U-boat positions, could route convoys away from danger. But the secrecy surrounding Ultra was absolute. Only a tiny number knew the codes were broken. Commanders receiving intelligence never learned the source. They were told it came from spies or reconnaissance. Great care was taken to provide alternative explanations. A reconnaissance flight would be sent before bombing a target, even though real intelligence came from reading enemy orders. This elaborate deception was necessary. The greatest fear was that Germans would realize their codes were compromised and change systems. If that happened, the advantage would vanish, and thousands more might perish. The secret had to be kept, even from soldiers whose lives it was saving. Dorothy understood this abstractly. She knew her work was highly classified, but she did not grasp the human dimension until one evening in April, when she attended a military dance in Washington. She met Army Air Corps Lieutenant Robert Morrison on leave before shipping to England. Handsome and kind, with an easy smile that made her feel less isolated, they danced and discovered surprising connection. When Robert mentioned he would be flying bombing missions over Europe, Dorothy felt a chill. She knew things he did not, knew intelligence that would guide those missions, knew the secret machinery behind it. She wanted to tell him to be careful, wanted to tell him people like her were working to give him every advantage, but she could not say any of that. The only thing she could say was, "I hope you stay safe." He smiled. "With the intelligence our guys are getting, we will know exactly where to hit them. Makes me feel better." She smiled back, keeping the secret locked inside. "I am glad." Back in Berlin, as spring turned to early summer, Klaus Zimmermann was working longer hours than ever. The war situation was deteriorating. In North Africa, German and Italian forces had been completely pushed out. In the Atlantic, submarine losses were mounting. On the Eastern Front, after the disaster at Stalingrad, the entire strategic position was in question, and everywhere it seemed the enemy had uncanny knowledge of German plans and positions. Klaus transmitted hundreds of messages each week, each one encrypted with the Enigma system he still trusted absolutely. But Hans Becker had noticed something that deeply troubled him. The Oberleutnant had developed habits, predictable patterns in how he formatted his messages, common phrases he used, consistent timing in his transmissions. Hans had tried once more to raise the issue of communication security, but Klaus had dismissed him irritably. "We follow proper procedures, Becker. The machine is mathematically unbreakable. This is settled science." But Hans had been thinking about something his mathematics instructor had said years ago in gymnasium. A system can be theoretically perfect, but in practice, perfection depends on perfect implementation. Humans are not perfect. Therefore, no human-operated system is truly unbreakable. One afternoon in late June, while Klaus was out of the office, Hans did something that could have gotten him arrested. He pulled out the log of recent transmissions and studied them carefully, looking for patterns. What he found alarmed him. They often sent messages at the same time each day. They frequently used the same preambles and signatures. And most damning, Klaus had gotten into the habit of testing the Enigma settings each morning by encrypting the same dummy message, a passage from Goethe that Klaus admired. If an enemy cryptanalyst could capture multiple versions of the same plaintext encrypted with different keys, Hans realized, they might be able to work backward to understand the machine's logic. He drafted a memo suggesting changes to procedures, randomizing transmission times, varying message formats, eliminating test messages. He left it on Klaus's desk. Klaus read the memo the next morning and called Hans into his office. His face was red with anger. "Becker, I do not appreciate you questioning established protocols. You are a Gefreiter, not a cryptographic expert." These procedures have been approved at the highest levels. Your job is to follow them, not to critique them. Hans stood at attention. I apologize, sir. I was only trying to improve security. Our security is adequate. More than adequate. Now, I do not want to hear another word about this. Is that clear? Yes, Oberleutnant. Hans returned to his desk, but he could not shake his unease. He had learned enough about probability and patterns to understand that the Enigma's theoretical strength was being undermined by its practical use. But no one wanted to hear it. Especially not Klaus Zimmermann, whose family pride and military indoctrination made him incapable of questioning the system he served. In July 1943, the situation reached a turning point. The German military was preparing a massive operation on the Eastern Front, Operation Citadel, the last great German offensive in the East, aimed at a bulge in the Soviet lines near the city of Kursk. The planning for this operation was extensive, and numerous encrypted messages about troop movements, tank concentrations, and timing passed through Klaus Zimmermann's hands. Every single one of those messages was intercepted, decrypted, and passed to Soviet intelligence through Allied channels. When Operation Citadel began on the 5th of July, the Soviet forces were not surprised. They were ready. They had prepared defensive positions of extraordinary depth. They knew exactly where the attacks would come. The German offensive, which should have achieved tactical surprise, instead ran headlong into prepared defenses. The result was catastrophic for Germany. Thousands of tanks destroyed, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and the loss of strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Germany would never again mount a major offensive in the East. Klaus Zimmermann read the reports of the failure with shock and grief. He had transmitted the operational orders himself, encrypted with the unbreakable enigma. How could the Soviets have known? In the communications center, a senior officer from headquarters arrived to brief them on a new concern. There is some discussion, the officer said carefully, that we may have a security problem. Some officials believe that enemy intelligence is too good to be explained by normal reconnaissance. Klaus felt a cold hand grip his heart. You do not mean our encryption has been compromised? The officer shook his head quickly. No. The Enigma system is mathematically unbreakable. Everyone agrees on this. We are looking into the possibility of spies or informants within the command structure. But I need you to be aware and vigilant. Report any unusual activity. After the officer left, Klaus sat in silence for a long time. Hans Becker watched him carefully but said nothing. The young Gefreiter had long since stopped trying to voice his concerns, but in his mind, Hans had reached a conclusion that Klaus could not. The system was broken. The enemy was reading their messages. And the German military command, blinded by pride and convinced of their own mathematical superiority, could not accept the truth even as it destroyed them. At Arlington Hall, Dorothy Chen had worked on the Kursk-related traffic intensively for weeks before the operation. She had been part of a team effort that had broken the daily keys quickly enough to provide actionable intelligence. When she learned through carefully sanitized reports that the operation had failed, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in her work, sadness at the loss of life, even enemy life, and a deep, somewhat frightening awareness of how much power resided in the seemingly innocuous work of pattern recognition and mathematical analysis. William Friedman had called her into his office after Kursk. You should know, he said, that the work you did on those intercepts made a material difference in the outcome. I cannot tell you the details. I can only say that lives were saved because you were good at your job. Dorothy had felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought of Robert Morrison, somewhere over Europe, and wondered if her mathematics had somehow kept him safer. Thank you, sir, she managed to say. Friedman had studied her with his tired, intelligent eyes. This work will haunt you sometimes, he said quietly. The knowledge of what we do here, the secrets we must keep, it is a burden, but it is necessary. She had nodded, understanding more than she could say. As 1943 wore on into 1944, the pace of the war accelerated. Allied forces invaded Italy. Planning began for the invasion of France, and throughout it all the invisible war of signals intelligence continued. Dorothy and thousands like her sat at desks, filling worksheets with letters and numbers, finding patterns, breaking keys, reading the enemy's secrets. And in Berlin, Klaus Zimmermann continued to encrypt messages with his Enigma machine, never knowing that each clack of the keys was another word intercepted, another secret revealed, another advantage handed to the enemy. Hans Becker eventually requested a transfer to a frontline unit. He could not bear to continue working in communications, could not shake his certainty that they were contributing to Germany's defeat through their very efforts to communicate securely. His request was granted, and he went east where at least the enemy was visible and the nature of the struggle was clear. Klaus never understood why Hans wanted to leave the relative safety of Berlin for the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. He took it as a sign of his assistant's youthful idealism and foolishness. In the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Enigma decrypts reached their peak importance. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but did not know where or when. They transmitted countless messages about troop dispositions, defensive preparations, and strategic assessments. Dorothy Chen worked on many of these intercepts. By now, she had become one of the most skilled cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall. She could often break a daily key in a matter of hours. Her insights were passed to military planners, contributing to the massive deception operation that convinced the Germans the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. On the 6th of June, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, German commanders were caught partially unprepared. Reinforcements were delayed. Strategic reserves were held back because of confusion about whether this was the main invasion, and critical hours were lost. The decrypted messages had played a role in all of this. Not the only role, not even the primary role. The invasion succeeded because of courage and sacrifice and overwhelming material superiority. But at the margins, in the realm of intelligence and deception, the broken codes had mattered. Klaus Zimmermann learned of the invasion from a frantic message he was ordered to encrypt and transmit. As he worked the Enigma keys, his hands were shaking. The fortress of Europe, which the German leadership had promised was impregnable, had been breached. The war was entering its final, desperate phase. After the invasion, as Allied forces pushed across France, the German communications network became increasingly chaotic. Radio discipline deteriorated. Operators made more mistakes under pressure. The messages grew more desperate. And at Arlington Hall and Bletchley Park, the cryptanalysts had an easier and easier time breaking the traffic, creating a feedback loop of intelligence success. One day in August, Dorothy was called into a meeting with senior intelligence officials. They wanted to know if the Germans had shown any signs of suspecting that Enigma was compromised. She had reviewed captured documents and interrogation reports. "No, sir," she said. "They appear to still have complete faith in the system. When their operations fail, they attribute it to espionage, bad luck, or overwhelming enemy resources. The possibility of cryptographic compromise does not seem to occur to them." One of the officials shook his head in wonder. "It is hard to believe," he said. "The evidence is all around them. How can they remain so blind?" Dorothy thought of Klaus Zimmermann, whose name she knew from the signature she had broken so many months ago. She imagined him, a professional military officer trained in certainty, unable to accept that the foundational assumption of his work was wrong. "Pride," she said, "and the inability to question authority. If their leadership tells them the system is unbreakable, they believe it, even when reality suggests otherwise." The official nodded thoughtfully. "Then let us hope they remain blind until the war is over." They did. Throughout the final year of the war in Europe, as Germany was crushed between advancing Allied armies from the west and Soviet armies from the east, German communications continued to use the Enigma system. They introduced some modifications, added complexity, changed procedures, but they never fundamentally doubted the machine, and Dorothy Chen continued to read their secrets. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Klaus Zimmermann sat in his bunker, surrounded by the chaos of a dying regime. The city above was being pulverized by artillery. Most of the staff had fled or been reassigned. But Klaus remained at his post, encrypting what few messages still needed to be sent. He had aged terribly in the past 2 years. His hair had gone grey, his face was gaunt, and his hands trembled with stress and malnutrition. But he still believed in the machine before him. It was the one constant in a world that had collapsed. On the 30th of April, he received word that there would be no more messages to encrypt. The end had come. He was ordered to destroy the Enigma machine and its key materials. He performed the destruction methodically, smashing the rotors, burning the codebooks, ensuring that nothing of intelligence value would fall into enemy hands. As he worked, he thought about all the messages he had sent, all the secrets he had protected. He had done his duty. He had followed proper procedure. The encryption had been mathematically sound. That the war had been lost was not the fault of the Enigma system. That was what he told himself. Soviet forces captured the bunker 2 days later. Klaus Zimmermann became a prisoner of war. He would spend 5 years in a Soviet camp before being repatriated to what would become East Germany. He never learned the truth about Enigma. The secret of Ultra remained classified for decades after the war ended. Hans Becker had been taken by the Soviets on the Eastern Front in January 1945. He survived the war and eventually returned to Germany. He studied mathematics at university, funded by the new West German government. He never spoke about his wartime suspicions regarding Enigma, but he devoted his career to the study of cryptographic security and the human factors that undermined theoretical strength. He published papers on procedural vulnerabilities and operator errors. Those who read his work found it insightful, though few knew the experiences that had inspired it. Dorothy Chen continued to work in signals intelligence after the war. The Cold War brought new challenges, new codes, new enemies. She married Robert Morrison, who had survived his bombing missions, and returned to America with a chest full of medals and grateful to be alive. They built a life together, though there was always a part of Dorothy's work that she could never discuss with him. In 1974, the British government began to declassify information about Bletchley Park and the breaking of Enigma. Dorothy watched the news reports with a mixture of relief and sadness. Finally, the secret could be told. Finally, the mathematicians and linguists and clerks who had fought the invisible war could be acknowledged. She received a letter from the National Security Agency thanking her for her wartime service and informing her that she was now free to discuss her role in the Signal Intelligence Service. She was in her 50s by then, a respected mathematician and mother of 2 children who had never quite understood why their mother was so reticent about her past. She told them the story, told them about Arlington Hall, about encrypted messages, about finding patterns in chaos, told them about Klaus Zimmermann, whose name she had learned from his own careless pride and whose secrets she had read for years. Her daughter asked the question that haunted Dorothy. Did you ever feel guilty? Reading private messages, using that information against people who did not know they were compromised? Dorothy thought for a long time before answering. The war was terrible, she said finally. Millions died. And yes, I contributed to some of those deaths by making Allied operations more effective. But I also believe I helped end the war sooner. Every month the war continued, more people perished. If the intelligence we provided shortened the war by even a few months, then perhaps we saved more lives than we cost. Her daughter nodded slowly. I think I understand. But Dorothy was never entirely certain that she did understand. The mathematics had been clean, the patterns elegant, the intellectual challenge exhilarating. But the human cost was never entirely calculable. In 1998, Dorothy Chen Morrison traveled to Britain for a reunion of cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, which had been preserved as a museum. She walked through the rooms where the bombs had churned, where brilliant minds had broken supposedly unbreakable codes, where the invisible war had been fought with paper and pencil and fierce concentration. She met other veterans of the Signals Intelligence War, including several who had worked at Arlington Hall alongside her. They were old now, these women and men who had been so young during the war. They shared memories, compared notes, marveled at what they had accomplished. And Dorothy thought about Klaus Zimmermann, who she had never met but whose professional life she had known intimately. She wondered what had become of him, whether he had ever learned the truth. She hoped, in a strange way, that he had found some peace, some way to reconcile his certainty with the reality of failure. The truth was, the Enigma system had not been broken by cryptographic weakness alone. It had been broken by human error, by procedural flaws, by the gap between theoretical security and practical implementation. It had been broken by operators who developed habits, by officers who valued pride over prudence, by a system that discouraged questioning and critical thinking. The machine itself was formidable. The humans using it were fallible, and that made all the difference. Dorothy Chen Morrison passed away in 2012 at the age of 93. Her obituary mentioned her work as a cryptanalyst during the Second World War, though it could not capture the full significance of what she had done. The mathematics of her life had been complex, the moral equations never quite balanced. But she had done her duty, kept her secrets, and played her part in the greatest conflict in human history. The story of signals intelligence in the Second World War is ultimately a story about knowledge and ignorance, certainty and doubt. Klaus Zimmermann had been certain, and his certainty had blinded him. Hans Becker had doubted, and his doubts had been vindicated but ignored. Dorothy Chen had understood the patterns, and her understanding had shaped the course of history in ways both profound and troubling. The lesson, if there is one, is that no system is ever truly unbreakable, no matter how perfect the mathematics. Security depends not just on theoretical strength, but on practical implementation, not just on machines, but on the humans who operate them. Pride and certainty can be more dangerous than the enemy's cryptanalysts, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with mathematics, not on battlefields, but in offices filled with paperwork and the quiet clicking of keys. The electromagnetic waves that carried Klaus Zimmermann's encrypted messages still propagate through space, weakening with distance but never truly disappearing. In some abstract sense, those signals are still out there, racing away from Earth at the speed of light, carrying secrets that are no longer secret, protecting information that no longer needs protection. And somewhere in the archives of the National Security Agency, carefully preserved, are the worksheets that Dorothy Chen filled out in 1943, showing her work, demonstrating how she found patterns in chaos and meaning in noise. They are a testament to human ingenuity, to the power of mathematics, and to the strange and sometimes terrible ways that knowledge can be weaponized. The Second World War was decided by many factors: industrial production, military strategy, individual courage and moral will. But it was also decided in part by people sitting at desks, staring at encrypted messages, finding the patterns that should not have existed, breaking the codes that should have been unbreakable. Klaus Zimmermann had said to cut the signal, believing that Morse code transmissions were untraceable and unbreakable when properly encrypted. But the Americans, and the British and thousands of cryptanalysts working in secret, were already listening. They had been listening all along, and what they heard helped shape the course of history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.